This is the Northern Great Plains military frontier, 1865 to 1890. My name is Larry Remley. The first of our programs in this video series will feature Robert M. Utley, the renowned historian of the Northern Plains military frontier and author of numerous books, articles, and many other materials concerning the history of this region. Our purpose is to provide in this interview a general overview of the military frontier during this critical half-century in American history, especially as it pertains to Fort Buford and North Dakota. My name is Larry Remley. I'm with the State Historical Society of North Dakota. This program, as the others in this series will be, is funded by a grant from the North Dakota Humanities Council. Mr. Utley, your book, Frontier Regulars, provides a general overview of the history of the Northern Great Plains military frontier. Can you, in a very brief overview, summarize that history? What was the reason why there was a military frontier on the Northern Plains?
Well, the Northern Plains, in fact, offer one of the clearest, most readily understood, most graphic illustrations of the advance of the military frontier in the American West, because the influences that stimulated the successive advances of the frontier are fairly clear and readily understood. Of course, the fur traders preceded the Army by a generation or more on the upper Missouri, and the Army seemed quite content to let the fur traders take care of themselves. But as we get into the period of the late 1840s and the 1850s, the Army begins to fix itself on the central plains, on the southern edges of the Northern Plains. And as settlement builds up in Minnesota, you have also an impulse for military protection moving into western Minnesota. So what you see is the Army kind of coming at two directions on a plains area that is already being exploited by the individualistic fur traders and trappers. It was the first war with the Sioux in 1875, which really centered on the Platte River, that led to the first movement of the military onto the Northern Plains. General Harney fought a battle with Sioux at Blue Water Creek. He then went to Fort Laramie and in his characteristic fashion sternly lectured more Sioux on what was expected of them. And then he marched off to the north and east toward the Black Hills, in effect daring the Sioux to come out and fight him, and ended up on the Missouri River, where the Army had bought the old fur trading post of Fort Pierre as a military post. So this was the first military post on the upper Missouri, Fort Pierre. And Harney intimidated more Sioux there and made peace with the Sioux, and thus established the Army on the upper Missouri. The only trouble is that Fort Pierre was a very uncomfortable place, and the soldiers didn't like it at all. Nobody liked it, and it was really a very bad idea to try to make military use of an old ramshackle falling down fur post.
The soldiers who were stationed at Fort Pierre sang kind of a ditty that was very derogatory, didn't they?
They had a little ditty that expressed their view of it. Something like this: "Oh, we don't mind the marching, nor the fighting do we fear, but we'll never forgive old Harney for bringing us to Pierre." And the fact of the matter is they didn't stay very long at Pierre. The following summer of 1856, the Army abandoned Fort Pierre and went some 150 miles down the Missouri River to establish Fort Randall. In the very southeastern corner of what is now South Dakota. So Fort Randall then became the most advanced post on the Missouri River. Actually, that was as far up as was really needed, because settlement in Dakota had not advanced very far. You had some settlements up on the Red River, on the eastern margins of Dakota, and then you had some settlements around Yankton, which was far south of Fort Randall. Of course, Dakota Territory was not established until 1861, so the fur trappers still had things pretty much to themselves on the upper Missouri and still were taking pretty good care of themselves.
Well, what was the major spur that really brought the Army into Dakota Territory in full force?
Well, this occurred during the Civil War years, 1861 to 65. Two developments drew the Army out of the initial frontier area, represented by Fort Randall on the south and Fort Abercrombie on the east. Fort Abercrombie had been established in 1857 near the head of navigation on the Red River, sort of as an advance guard for the Minnesota settlements. The next impulse then came as a result of two developments. First was the bloody uprising of the Sioux in Minnesota in 1862. General Henry H. Sibley mobilized the Minnesota volunteers and brought order back to Minnesota, but the Santees, who had been principally concerned in that uprising, many of them fled westward into Dakota Territory, creating conditions of unrest. The second development was the discovery of gold in Montana, what's now Montana, beyond the head of the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. A lot of the gold seekers came up the Missouri River on the steamboats that supplied the fur trading post, and some hardy souls even struck out overland to reach the diggings. And of course there was the demand then on two scores to mop up after the Sioux uprising these refugees from Minnesota, and to give protection to the gold seekers heading west across Dakota and Montana. Actually, we should note here that those overland routes never were used very much. They were a product more of town boomers and Chamber of Commerce types who hoped that Minnesota would be the kickoff place for the major immigration to the mines. But the images created convinced everybody that there was a need for protection, and like all bureaucracies, the Army was not slow to take advantage of the opportunity to advance itself onto the northern plains. So in the summer of 1863, you have a two-pronged military offensive onto the upper Missouri. General Sibley came from Minnesota with one army westward into Dakota, and General Alfred Sully organized another army down at Sioux City, Iowa, came up the Missouri River, and their purpose was to clean up the Santee Sioux refugees from Minnesota and intimidate the Teton Sioux, who were expected to give trouble to the immigration to Montana. Sibley won 3 victories against the Santees at 3 battles northeast of present Bismarck, while Sully, after a very late start, finally ran down a bunch of Yanktonites who of dubious hostility at Whitestone Hill. So the whole thing could be considered quite a smashing success.
Did it achieve its purposes? Did it smash the Sioux?
No Indian war ever achieves its purposes. This was one of the problems that the Army faced. They always expected this Indian war to be the last Indian war, and it never was. However, it can be considered one of the more successful military operations against Indians. except that usually these succeed mainly in stirring Indians up further than they were before. The point is, for our discussion here, is that this operation left the military frontier on the northern plains in a much advanced location, because Sully, with becoming modesty, established a fort named Fort Sully near where old Fort Pierre was, near present Pierre, South Dakota, on the Missouri, in the fall of 1863, before he went back to Iowa. Then the following summer, Sully came back up the river and he established another fort, Fort Rice, near the mouth of the Cannonball River. So this represents a great leap of 300 miles from Fort Randall of the military frontier on the northern plains.
Mm-hmm. Now, Fort Rice is one of the lesser known of them, at least in the modern era, of the Dakota forts. Now, how important was Fort Rice?
Well, I think Fort Rice was tremendously important in the context of the early and middle 1860s. First, because it, for a year or two, represented a sort of advance guard of the U.S. Army on the northern plains frontier. Secondly, because it provided a base for operations of General Sully in the campaign of 1864, the second campaign on the northern plains. And this one was likewise tremendously successful and significant, because Sully, with great military ambitions, was not content that Fort Rice be the advance guard of the military frontier. His plans for the summer of 1864 were to push that frontier way out onto the west and establish it firmly on the Yellowstone River in what is now Montana. So he intended to march west from Fort Rice, intimidate the Teton Sioux, all in the name of this migration of gold seekers to Montana, which was really a very small migration, and build a fort on the Yellowstone River at the mouth of the Powder. So Sully had a pretty formidable army, and he marched west from Fort Rice. He found a considerable aggregation of Teton Sioux near Killdeer Mountain, which is up near the Little Missouri River in the northwestern part of the state. And it really gave them quite a sound trouncing. Very rarely did the U.S. Army manage to run down Indians and defeat them in battle, but Sully did. And after routing the Tetons at Killdeer Mountain, he skirmished his way across the North Dakota Badlands and finally made his way to the Yellowstone River. He had loaded several steamboats with materials to build this fort, but as you know, the water comes down in the Yellowstone pretty quickly as the season advances, and all of the boats couldn't get up that high. So Sully settled for second best, marched down the Yellowstone to its mouth, where the old fur trading post of Fort Union existed. You see a pattern here of the fur traders being the advance guard for the Army. So there was kind of an infrastructure in place for the Army to move into. Sully dumped all of the supplies for his fort on the prairie there at the mouth of the Yellowstone and stationed a guard there for a winter and told them to survey a post for survey a reservation for a military post, and went back home. So he had left kind of another tentative advance of the military frontier there at the mouth of the Yellowstone River, however tenuous it was.
Now, that particular post became Fort Buford.
That became Fort Buford.
Now, how important was Fort Buford to this advance of the military frontier?
Well, it became for a time the advance guard. It was the substitute for the post that Sully had hoped to locate on the Yellowstone River. So its founding in 1866 represented another tremendous forward movement of the military frontier up the Missouri, clear to the mouth of the Yellowstone River. Fort Buford was strategically located on the Missouri, which is the supply corridor, not only for the fur trappers, but for the military. So it plays a very important part logistically in the operations that that followed over the next 20 years, simply because it's a place where the steamboats always stopped and could offload and accumulate their materials. But for a time, probably 5 or 6 years in the late 60s, this was the advanced bastion, stuck out there defiantly and somewhat helplessly in the middle of Sioux country, remote, cut off pretty much from communication entirely, cut off from communication with the rest of the world during the winter months. And in fact, during the winter of 1866 to 67, rumors were rife back east that the whole garrison had been wiped out by Indians. So you don't associate any dramatic Indian battles or campaigns like Custer and the Little Bighorn with Fort Buford. But it is a very stable, solid installation in the middle of the Sioux country that performs a very important function logistically, administratively, and operationally for about 2 decades.
Now, how did the Army fill in behind Fort Buford? Did it build a line of support that eventually, made Fort Buford less isolated?
Well, of course, the military is always going to take advantage of current conditions if they're favorable to enhance its capabilities. The more forts they could build, the better they liked it. And still we're dealing with this fiction of the great migration from Minnesota to the Montana mines. So in 1867, only a year after Fort Buford, you have 3 more forts sprouting in what is now North Dakota. Downstream, a short distance from Fort Buford, you have Fort Stevenson. On the south shore of Devil's Lake, you have Fort Totten. And on the Cheyenne River, over near the Red River, Fort Ransom. Fort Wadsworth had already been built near the lakes heading the 2 big rivers, the Red and Minnesota River. So there's a whole network of forts taking shape here on the eastern end of these routes to the gold fields. And the same thing is happening off to the west in Montana, where you have Camp Cook and Fort Shaw and Fort Ellis all coming into being to protect the gold seekers after they got there. And then another, what was expected to be popular route to the gold fields, the Bozeman Trail, from the Platte River, Fort Laramie. They built 3 forts, Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith, to guard the Bozeman Trail. So what you have is a great circle perimeter of military posts all around the Sioux country of the Yellowstone Basin and the Powder River, all in the name of the gold seekers heading for western Montana.
Now, eventually this chain of forts, or this perimeter of forts, had to be was brought into definite military play. Now, this was in the Great Sioux War of 1875 and 1876 and thereafter. How did these forts and the military frontier respond to this challenge of the Plains Indians in the middle 70s?
Well, it elaborated itself even more. There are several influences that we need to pinpoint that occurred between the establishment of this network of forts and the really tremendous hostilities of the middle 1870s. First of all, you had the Red Cloud Wars, the Sioux Wars of 1866 to 68. These centered on the Bozeman Trail, the shortcut to the mines from the central overland route. Actually, not many gold seekers used that route either because it was too dangerous. And the Army had a hard enough time just maintaining their position there. This was the scene of the Fetterman Massacre of 1866, the wagon box and the hayfield fights of 1867. That Red Cloud War ended in victory for the Sioux for very pragmatic reasons, because as the railroad moved westward along the Platte River, it became much easier to get to the Montana gold fields from Utah than it did either from over the Bozeman Trail or from Minnesota. So we have the Treaty of 1868, which is a landmark document in relationships with the Sioux of the Northern Plains. The Treaty of 1868 ended the Red Cloud Wars and to the humiliation of the Army, required it to abandon those forts on the Bozeman Trail. But beyond the humiliation, the results really were all in the white man's favor, because the Indians agreed to settle on the Great Sioux Reservation. Essentially all of what is now South Dakota, west of the Missouri River. They promised that they would gather around a series of Indian agencies established on the Missouri River where they could be conveniently supplied by steamboat. Well, you had a series of agencies established on the Missouri, and so this is kind of an interim impulse for more military expansion, because you had to have soldiers either at the agencies or nearby to keep watch over the Indians. So this is one influence that leads to a further elaboration of the military frontier. Another one is the advent of the Northern Pacific Railroad. During the early 1870s, the Northern Pacific began to make its way across northern Dakota Territory toward the Missouri River at what is now Bismarck. The Army felt very strongly that the key to the Indian problem was the transcontinental railroads. General Sherman, the commanding general of the Army, General Sheridan, who commanded all of the Great Plains, they were absolutely committed to using the Army to advance in every way possible, help in every way possible the construction of the transcontinental railroads. So the Northern Pacific Railroad is coming across Dakota and aiming at the very heart of the Teton Sioux domain. So this is the stimulus for more forts. Fort Seward at the railroad crossing of the James River, and the most important of all, Fort Abraham Lincoln, where the railroad was to cross the Missouri River opposite Bismarck. Of course, things slowed down because the recession of 1873 knocked the props out from under the Northern Pacific, and construction stopped at the Missouri River for quite a number of years. But Fort Lincoln was established in connection with the railroad, and it became the platform for the next leap westward of the military frontier. Another influence that we need to note as conditions build up for the War of 1876 is the military expedition into the Black Hills. Custer, who had come to the Northern Plains with the 7th Cavalry in 1873, led an exploratory expedition into the Black Hills in 1874. This was part of the Great Sioux Reservation, guaranteed to the Indians under the Treaty of 1868. Of course, they found gold there. And again, you have a great rush of gold seekers to a part of the country that the Indians regarded quite rightly as their home. So the Indians are very upset over the Black Hills. They're very upset over the Northern Pacific Railroad. Even though it stopped at the Missouri, surveyors had worked their way into the Yellowstone Valley, and military escorts had skirmished with the Sioux for 3 summers running to protect the surveyors. One of those expeditions was led by Custer, and he took station at Fort Lincoln after that expedition of 1873.
Now, this led eventually to the Great Sioux War of 1876. What was the purpose of the Great Sioux War of 1876?
Well, the purpose really was to neutralize all of these Indians running freely over the Yellowstone Basin.
Why was that? Why did these Indians need to be neutralized? What was the rationale?
We should go back to our Treaty of 1868. Red Cloud and the majority of the Sioux had committed themselves to settle on the reservation. But there was an aggregation of maybe 500 Indians all told. I guess we'd say several thousand, with 500 fighting men all told, under the general leadership of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who scorned that treaty, vowed that they would never settle on a reservation and become lackeys of the white man, and insisted upon roaming this buffalo country in the Yellowstone and Powder River basins without any connection with the white man. Unfortunately, they did a little raiding on the side, on the Montana settlements and along the Platte River, which the whites took as pretext for the attempt to neutralize these Indians. But the principal problem was that in order to conclude another treaty for the sale of the Black Hills, now that gold is found there, it became necessary to neutralize those Indians roaming in the Powder River country, because when they got the reservation Indians together to sign a treaty, these so-called roamers from the north showed up and made such a fuss that they intimidated the reservation chiefs into refusing to sign. So these guys had to be neutralized if we were going to throw a facade of legality over what really was the theft of the Black Hills. And so it was a contrived deal in which the Indians in the Powder River country were ordered to come back to the reservation, or to come to the reservation by a given deadline, or else face military activity. They were in the Powder River country quite legally under the Treaty of 1868, but the orders went out. The Indians did not report as ordered, and so the Army launched a 3-pronged offensive on the Yellowstone Basin in the summer of 1876. This was the one that led to the famous last stand of Custer on the Little Bighorn.
Now, that military strategy had 3 prongs. You know, what were those prongs, and how did this perimeter of forts affect that campaign?
Okay, you remember that we have established a perimeter around the Yellowstone Basin, and it provides a base of operations and of logistical support for all 3 of the prongs of this offensive. From the west in Montana, Fort Ellis, which we mentioned earlier, is base for Colonel John Gibbon, moving eastward. In the south, Forts Laramie and Fort Fetterman. Fort Fetterman having replaced those 3 Bozeman Trail forts the Army had to give up in the Treaty of 1868, was base for General George Crook's movement northward into the Yellowstone Basin. And then on the east, and the best known of all the 3 prongs, Fort Abraham Lincoln provided the base for General Alfred Terry's movement eastward, or westward. And it was Terry's column that included the entire 7th Cavalry under Custer. To to supply the Terry column, and after it united with Gibbon, the Army leased 3 or 4 steamboats, which carried supplies up the Missouri River and up the Yellowstone. And here's where Fort Buford began to figure again importantly, because Fort Buford was kind of the link between, by way of the steamboats, between the troops in the field and the base back there at Fort Lincoln. In addition, the infantry garrison of Fort Buford provided the escorts for the wagon trains and the guards for the supply depots down on the Yellowstone River.
So the columns came together in Montana, or were intended to come together in Montana. What was the outcome of that campaign?
Well, Terry and Gibbon managed to come together. Crook ran into a bunch of Sioux and got pretty badly bloodied, and so scared that he fell back on his supply base and refused to move until he was very heavily reinforced. So he was kind of counted out of the operations of June 1876. Terry and Gibbon united and contrived a movement against the Sioux, who were known pretty well to be in the Little Bighorn Valley or somewhere around there. A movement in which Custer would move up the Rosebud Creek with the 7th Cavalry, while Terry, Gibbon, and the infantry would move around the Yellowstone up the Bighorn and come in from the north. It wasn't to have been a coordinated movement. Custer was expected, contrary to a lot of the debate today, if he could find the Indians, to whip them. What happened here was that they had been following these so-called roamers that you and I discussed a few moments ago. 2,000 or 3,000 Indians with at the most 500 to 800 fighting men, which was quite a manageable opposition when you're dealing with a whole cavalry regiment of 600 well-organized soldiers. As Custer moved up the Rosebud, quite unknown to him and unexpected by anyone, and quite coincidentally, all of these Indians from the agencies who come out in the summertime for a lark with their friends, the roamers, they began to arrive in huge numbers. So within a matter of 2 or 3 days, those 500 warriors became something like 2,000 warriors, just almost overnight. And a force that had expected to be quite manageable became quite unmanageable. And it was into this aggregation of Indians that Custer stumbled on the 25th of June, and the results, of course, are known to everybody around the world.
What was the net result of that campaign in terms of the northern military frontier?
Well, the net result was that the Indians scattered, and all of these ponderous armies that were concentrated to take revenge did nothing but slog around in the mud and the snow with no chance of catching up and fighting a battle. But the result, that was the high water mark of the Sioux, even so. For years, Sheridan and Sherman had been trying to get money out of Congress for some more forts. They wanted to build that fort in the Yellowstone country that Sully had hoped to put there back in 1864, but they wanted to put more forts and subject the whole Yellowstone Basin, which is now the last holdout of the Sioux, to a military occupation that would open it to stockmen and farmers and deny it to the Sioux. So the great drama, the great impact upon public sentiment of the Custer battle got Sherman and Sheridan their money, and they were able to build Fort Keogh at the mouth of Tongue River, where Miles City now is in Montana, Fort Custer at the mouth of the Little Bighorn, Fort Meade down in the Black Hills, and ultimately two more forts, Fort McGinnis and Fort Assiniboine, in the Judith Basin and up along Milk River in Montana. So the result of the campaign of 1876, even though it was a tremendous victory for the Sioux, was to subject the last remaining gaps in the Northern Plains frontier to military occupation. Most of the Indians had gone into their agencies and surrendered in the spring of 1877. But the war really wasn't officially over until the Sitting Bull surrendered. He and the diehards had taken refuge in Canada, and they found it very difficult to feed themselves there because the buffalo stayed south of the boundary, and every time they followed it across the boundary, there was General Miles, Bear's Coat, waiting to chase them back into Canada. So they were subjected to 5 years of slow starvation, finally had to give up. They came in most appropriately, most symbolically, to Fort Buford in 1881 and surrendered. So with the surrender of Sitting Bull, for all practical purposes, the Northern Plains frontier has been militarized and open to settlement. Stockmen are, by the time the last spike was driven in the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1883, the Yellowstone Basin had opened itself to stockmen. Farmers were coming in on the Northern Pacific Railroad. Dakota was filling up with settlers. And it was the twilight year for the Indians, and of course for the Army too, because with the Indians conquered by a combination, not by the Army, by a combination of soldiers and settlers and above all railroads, it was the end of any need for the Army on the Northern Plains either. And so this Northern Plains frontier just almost collapsed within a matter of 2 or 3 years at the end of the 1880s.
And yet some of the forts lingered on until the middle 1890s. Why did these forts persist that late? What was the reasoning for...
Well, there really was no reasoning. You had to have a place to shelter soldiers. And the regular army was of X size, 25,000, and the soldiers had to live somewhere. This is one reason. The other reason, not unknown today when it comes to federal installations, was that any proposal to abandon an Army fort was immediately met with great protest by the local community and therefore by their representatives in the Congress. So it proved very difficult to close down some of these forts after their purpose had been fulfilled. But by the middle 90s, most of them were gone, except for a very few that continued to be military installations simply to house troops up into the 20th century. Fort Keogh endured possibly up into the 1930s. Fort Meade was a horse cavalry post on the eve of the World War II. Some of the last horse cavalry trained at Fort Meade in the Black Hills.
Now, if you were to assess the overall importance of the northern military frontier, can you do so in a few sentences?
I think that any assessment has to do two things. It has to spotlight that military frontier. Those advanced ranks of United States soldiers, those lines of military forts going in spurts across the Northern Plains, as one of the decisive influences in the subjugation of the Northern Plains to the white man's civilization. But having said that, I think we have to concede that there was another side to the coin, and that contrary to maybe our conventional images now, the soldiers didn't go out and conquer the Indians and make way for the hardy pioneers who follow. that the process involved all of them working pretty much in tandem. We noted at the beginning of this discussion that the fur trappers preceded the soldiers by a whole generation, so we have to give them credit. The farmers' frontier, the stockman's frontier, certainly the railroad builders, all of them joined together with the soldiers in extinguishing the Indian possession of this part of the country. We've discussed this whole process in terms pretty much of a white man's frontier moving westward. That inevitably does disservice to the Indian side of the story. We must keep in mind that this country was possessed by the Indians and had been for a good number of centuries before the white man came. But the context of our discussion has been one of analyzing the historical forces that denied this country to the Indians and laid the groundwork for the northern plains to become the modern states of North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana.
Okay. Can we, is it possible for us to assess, as part of this general historical progression that we've been talking about, is it possible for us to use, to see this as a political movement as well? The subjugation of the plains, the military frontier as an agent of American policy and American politics?
I'm not sure how deliberate and planned this whole process was. I don't think it was. The fact of the matter is that the government was dragged along in a political sense by demographic forces, by population movements over which it had no control. The government was not a cynical thing sitting back there in Washington and plotting the downfall of the Indians. The government was inclined, as all governments are, to respond to legal imperatives, to legal obligations. And just as a case study, the Black Hills were part of Indian country under the treaty. The government would much prefer to have let it remain that way, except that the movement of population into the Black Hills forced the government to lend protection, which in turn forced the government to break its treaty obligations.
So in other words, what we have here is the government as a reactor to policy, and that policy being non-formulated by the policymakers, but rather a product of the reality of the movements of the people themselves.
That's right. The government is responding to pressures brought upon them by a population that is demanding federal services, and you find this even after the policy, if we want to call it that, of conquest is pretty well fixed. We are committed by policy to subduing the western wilderness, to conquering the Indians, to planting them on reservation. You have, as we've intimated earlier, very decided political pressures playing on Washington from a local population to have forts built nearby. And so one of the phenomena you see as you follow the military frontier across the west, not just in the northern plains, is forts popping up where there is not much strategic need for them, simply because the local population says, we've got to have protection from the Indians, when what they really mean is we want the economic stimulus of a fort with all those soldiers here to undergird our local economy. So the military frontier advanced in response both to strategic requirements and to non-strategic political influences.
I'd like to take the remaining 15 minutes or so of our discussion and talk a little bit about some perhaps lesser topics here, some personalities involved with the Northern Plains, and also about some incidents involved with the Northern Plains. First of all, I'd like you to talk for a minute, if you will, Bob, about the role of Sheridan and Miles and these other famous 19th century generals. You know, how do they fit into this Northern Military Plains frontier?
General William Tecumseh Sherman was General-in-Chief of the Army back in Washington or St. Louis. Sherman was very much an individualist, and when he got fed up with conditions in Washington, he simply uprooted his headquarters and moved to St. Louis. This was Sherman's army out west here on the frontier. They idolized Sherman, the great hero of the Civil War, and the man now whose whole being was wrapped up in their well-being. So he played a role not fending off, but dealing with the political structure back in Washington, but not having much influence on policy. But he was a great father figure, if we can call him such. Closer to the scene of operations, and much more directly concerned with General Philip H. Sheridan. He was the #2 soldier at the time. And he was located in Chicago, commanding the military division of the Missouri, which was broken down into several departments all along the Northern Plains from Canada to Mexico. Then if we come one step closer to the Northern Plains, it falls into 2 military departments. One of them commanded by General Alfred Terry during most of the period we're talking about, during the 1876 campaign. He was headquartered in St. Paul. General George Crook commanded the Department of the Platte, which had Nebraska and the southern part of it. He was headquartered in Omaha. This explains how Terry and Crook got to be field commanders. General Custer, of course, was our most flamboyant and best known Indian fighters, however deserved or not. He was simply a regimental commander and post commander at Fort Abraham Lincoln. But he had the reputation, both in the Army and throughout the nation, of being one of the premier Indian fighters of the U.S. Army. And he was expected to lead the Fort Lincoln column in the 1876 campaign. A combination of political factors. He was pretty naive politically, and he was a Democrat, and he got himself in over his head with the Grant administration. And so he very nearly ended up not going at all because he made the president angry, and for a lieutenant colonel down the way, that's not a very wise thing to do. He was to have commanded the Eastern Column. He ended up going in command of his own regiment with General Terry in overall command. That whole 1876 campaign was pretty badly botched by all of the generals. They just did everything wrong. And we might note on the other side of the coin that the Indians did everything right. The soldiers didn't necessarily lose that campaign because of things they failed to do. They lost it also because the Indians won. You mentioned General Miles. He was not involved in the early stages of the operation. He came in as part of the reinforcements, and he pulled everyone's chestnuts out of the fire. Crook and Terry. What happened to Custer was absolutely devastating to everyone, totally demoralizing. And they figured they couldn't take a step out of their defenses without a huge army, when the fact of the matter was that was the last thing they needed. Now that the Indians had scattered, they needed small mobile outfits to run them down. Miles understood that. Miles fought in the same tradition that Custer did. Miles had a great regard and friendship for Custer, which was returned. They saw things the same way. So Miles stayed out there during the winter after all of the rest of them went back to their forts. And it was Miles, more than anyone, campaigning during the winter when the Indians didn't like to fight, that who brought the Indians to their final surrender. Crook undertook some operations in the winter, but they were very short-lived, and it was instead Miles campaigning all winter. He was a young guy like Custer. He was a Civil War hero like Custer, who had become a general in his middle 20s. And he became something of a legend to the Indians. He, campaigning in the winter, wore a big bearskin overcoat, and the Indians called him Bear's Coat Miles. So he did quite an outstanding job. He's usually kind of downgraded, or we don't give him his full due, because he was a very unlikable guy. He was vain and egotistical and boastful and inclined to criticize everybody else's performance while elevating his own. He also was married to the niece of General Sherman and tried everything in his power to influence Sherman to play favorites, which is something Sherman refused to do. But Miles probably, in my view, was the greatest of all Indian fighters, most consistently over the years, not only on the northern plains, but on the central plains and in the southwest.
One question with regard to the way these generals viewed their opponents. Now, how did the military on the northern plains view the Indians themselves? Did they estimate them as good fighters or as worthy opponents for the military? How did they view them?
Well, they had a very high regard for their fighting capabilities. Otherwise, I think you would have to characterize the attitude of one of ambivalence. On the one hand, they admired their fighting qualities and the colorful aspects of their culture. On the other hand, like everybody else in the 19th century, they regarded them as savages, probably not really, the word civilized was a favorite one then, and the aim of U.S. policy was to civilize the Indians. Well, of course, the Indians already had their civilization, and they didn't really care to be civilized into our civilization, but nonetheless, this was the objective. I think the Army tended rather hardly to look upon the Indians as not receptive to this process, that they would have to be conquered before anything further could take place in their transformation. As a matter of reality, however, the Army as against the Indian, man for man, the Indian was a far better fighting man than the individual U.S. soldier. He couldn't hold a candle to the Indian in individual fighting, one-on-one fighting qualities. What gave the Army its edge, and it turned out to be a decisive one, was that these mediocre fighting men were organized into fighting units, disciplined, commanded, and fighting with teamwork, which the Indians could never achieve. The Indian method of fighting was a very individualistic one. Everyone went out and did his own thing. And so when you had a body of Indians fighting a body of soldiers, well, almost always, and Custer, of course, is an exception, almost always the soldiers could win because they're organized and fighting with teamwork, and the Indians aren't.
We need to wrap this up because we're closing in on the end of our hour here. Can you, in a few words, perhaps summarize the place of the northern military frontier in the overall military history of the United States? I mean, what is its significance to American history as a whole?
Well, it's difficult to break out the northern plains from the rest of the American West. Um, it is one of a series, not a series, but of a group of geographical regions, rather discrete in its boundaries, and with its own individual historical features that characterize it, that make up the overall American frontier, and specifically the overall American Western military frontier. I would characterize these as the Northern Plains, the Northern Rockies, the American Southwest, Texas, and the Central Plains. It would be difficult to make a case for any one of these taking supremacy over the others as to historical significance as a region. So the best I can say is it is one of several very significant regions with its own frontier process, which can be followed in terms not only of the military, but of the other components of the American frontier movement, which differs in ways and resembles in many ways the various other geographical regions that we've mentioned. And they all piece together to make a great mosaic of the American frontier movement from the Mississippi to the Pacific coast, which was an enormously significant step in transforming what had been a few colonies along the eastern seaboard into a continental nation.
And that is the northern military frontier. We have been speaking this morning with Robert M. Utley, the renowned American historian of the military frontier in the Great Plains and the West. This is the northern military frontier and part of a series promoted by the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Thank you very much.